Alright, today I want to talk about the upcoming Game of Thrones Living Card Game, the second edition. The first edition of the game, my gaming group and I played religiously for quite a while. Every year, for 3 months out of the year, it would dominate what we played. It would be the only thing we played while Game of Thrones was on the air. So from like April through July, we were just obsessed. Every other game we played went away. That was until this year. This year, Game of Thrones came back, and about halfway through the season, we noticed none of us had mentioned bringing it out. And we all thought that was odd till we started talking about it, and we realized there were aspects of the game that we just no longer enjoyed. It'd become a chore to play at best, and at worst, it became an exercise in frustration. And then came the announcement that they were doing a second edition. And at first, we were like, well, we don't really care. We're just going to be done with that game. It's not worth it. And then we started reading about the game. And I think a lot of the things that they're doing sound really good. This is something I've wanted to do for a while. I think the game actually releases tomorrow on the first day of Gen Con, so that's very exciting. I'm going to be watching the stores I go to all day to see if any of them put it up, if they have it yet. I'm sure you can get raped on eBay for it, but I'll hold off there. What I wanted to go over here was an open letter that one of the designers, Nate French, put out when they first announced the second edition. And now most of it is just his personal experiences and stuff, but this latter half of the letter touches on things they wanted to change. So I wanted to go over that and discuss what he wrote, my gaming group's experiences with it, and how we feel about it going forward. So the first thing he mentions here is the aspects they wanted to keep, because they felt this was the core of what made a Game of Thrones living card game a Game of Thrones living card game. The first thing was the plot deck. And he says here, in many ways, the plot deck is the game's most distinguishing feature, and is frequently the first element that players identify when asked what they like about the game. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that personally, but it is something fairly unique to Game of Thrones, and it gives a unique way of determining who goes when and giving certain advantages and disadvantages on turns. So it definitely injects uniqueness into the game and excitement. So I'm glad they kept that. Next was the challenge phase. The challenge phase as we know it, featuring the military, intrigue, and power challenges. The challenge phase is the game's most tactical arena and is usually the phase in which the most direct conflict between players occurs. That's true, but it's not any different than most of the main phases in other games, for the most part. I'm still not surprised that they kept it. Characters. Characters are central to the game's action. George R.R. Martin's series is heavily character-driven, and the game should be as well. That I definitely agree. This game uses characters in ways that a lot of other games don't. It feels like those characters are on the board, and it feels like those characters are doing things. So that's very cool. And unique characters must die. The Discard and Dead Pile capture this important aspect of the Song of Ice and Fire novels. I agree. I think it's neat that if you have Cersei Lannister and she dies, that's it. You can't play Cersei Lannister again until you find a way to get her out of your dead pile. It can make things a little frustrating, but that's the game. And then the game is won by accumulating power for your faction card. And on characters you control, a game's victory condition establishes what a player is trying to do. And this motivation informs the player's decision-making, and thereby his or her experience of the game in a number of direct and indirect ways. Gaining power, just instead of trying to reduce somebody to 0 health or whatever, you're trying to achieve 20 power. It's a victory condition. It's kind of a neat one, so I like it. And then the nature of the flop. Having the game begin in media res, as opposed to the gradual amping up that defines many card games, enables players to quickly focus on its most engaging elements, the plot phase and the challenge phase, instead of obsessing on early game tricks and development concerns. It also adds to the game's replay value by adding more differentiation to the opening of each individual matchup. And if you're not familiar, with what this means. You get a free turn. Everybody gets, I think it's 7 gold to spend on cards to put into play. So everybody gets a free turn to play stuff from their hand. So you actually aren't setting up. You don't have to skip a turn because you're first or do anything weird that some of the other games do. Everyone just gets a free turn before the game begins. From there, we needed to identify the elements that we felt were holding the game back. And I think they did a really good job with choosing what elements they thought were holding the game back. Namely, Moribund. If you're not familiar with the game, or if you're familiar with the game but not intimately familiar with the game, they have a series of flow charts you can download and print off from the website. And many of our games ground to a complete halt as we would try to determine who would go what and go where by using these flowcharts, which led into other flowcharts, which led into other flowcharts. And a lot of it was this moribund state. And if something's moribund, it's dead, but not dead yet, and on its way to the discard pile, but not in the discard pile or the dead pile. And it was all just a pain in the butt. And they need to revamp the entire thing and get rid of all these flowcharts and just make it a simple system. I think they've done that from what I've seen in other previews. Influence was something we started playing during the living card game era. We never played the card game, and apparently this was something big in the card game era, the collectible card game version era, where you had something more persistent to spend than gold. We found we almost never used influence. It was really a non-factor. It was just something on our cards that we'd occasionally use for a trick here or there. So losing it from the game really doesn't really change anything. We never really used it anyway. Next are crests. It was always a little weird. Like I said, crests were just glorified traits. There was really no reason to separate them. So they're combining them, and I think that's a good decision. Other timing quirks. Like we said, flowchart after flowchart after flowchart. You'd read one flowchart, that would flow into another chart, that would flow into another chart, and still possibly not get you the answer you were looking for. So, fixing the timing quirks, as they call them, definitely useful. And then keyword bloat. It seems at the end, they were adding a new keyword every set, and some of the keywords were overpowering, some were only useful in that set. It was just a lot to learn, and you ended up with all these little pamphlets from the sets. Oh, what is this keyword again? And you'd run to the paper, and so it looks like they're just going to have a core set of keywords, and they're going to be building on that, which is good. I think a minimalist sense is a good thing. And next, they identified areas where they could improve the game. The attachment card type. Honestly, very little used in our game. So if they could make the attachments more useful, we'd be all for it. We used a few here and there, mainly in the Targaryen deck, I think. Targaryen and Stark deck, stuff that had the most attachments used. Mostly because they had nasty, nasty attachments that literally let you kill whoever you wanted. And there were a handful here and there. But for the most part, we didn't use them. So it'd be neat to see them more useful, more universally useful anyway. The gold curve, by the end of the game, by the end of the expansions, we found we were all kind of generating the same amount of gold, whether you were Lannister or Stark or Baratheon. None of us wanted for gold. I'd like to see them diversify it so that it feels more like the houses should feel. I know that's hard because gold is how you get things into play. And so they say what they did here. They tried to get most of the tournament decks were in the 0 to 3 card cost range. In the new edition, we are stretching the game's cost curve so that more gold is available to players and more cost slots are relevant when building decks. So that would be kind of cool. Because in the old game, it was true you could get 5 or 6 gold in a turn, potentially a lot more if you had certain lands, and you'd play 5 or 6 cards. So So I'd like to see some more expensive cards that are actually worth playing. The draw cap, another thing. You could draw like 4 cards a turn, I think. So you just had to keep this running mental total. How many cards have I drawn? How many cards have I drawn? So they introduced an entirely new mechanic. They have the, what do they call it here? For the new edition, we were doing with the draw cap and replacing it with a more elegant and dynamic check against abusive card accumulation strategies by adding a reserve value to each plot card that caps its owner's hand size in the taxation phase, which I think is a lot better than, like I said, you could draw, I think it was 4 cards every turn. You drew 2 at the beginning of a turn, so that's half of it right there. So you had to keep track of not drawing any more than 2 the rest of the entire turn. Not a huge thing, but kind of a pain in the butt. I'm kind of glad to see it go away. Plot deck building. This essentially says they're going to let you have, instead of just one version of a plot in your plot deck, you can have up to 2 versions of 2 of the same plots in your plot deck. So that's kind of cool. They say it allows for diversity, and the fact that once you see something once doesn't mean you won't see it again. And I get that, because there were a lot of plot cards we were watching out for, and once we saw it play, we're like, all right, and then we'd change the way we played. So not being able to do that could be kind of cool. Treaties. Before, if you wanted to include members of houses that didn't belong to your house, it was like their gold cost was increased by 2 or something. Like they say here, it was kind of clunky. We never did it, as a matter of fact. I can't remember a single out-of-house deck that we ever had. Here, they introduced a new loyalty mechanic combined with the ability to select a support faction and move agenda. I think in the end, what they ended up doing is you can take another house as part of your deck, but you have to have a certain number of your core house cards in your deck to keep the balance. They expanded the factions, so instead of, I think there were 5, they're now up to 8. I think they added the Night's Watch, which is kind of cool, House Tyrell, and I cannot think of the, I can't think of the other one. I know they added Night's Watch and House Tyrell. I can't think of the other one, though. The Night's Watch was really good. Their preview was very well done. Now they say here, a feast of gorgeous original artwork. They did a lot of new art for this new set, and I'm not in love with all of it. Some of it's really good, some of it I didn't really care for. So, in closing, they kept the things that they felt they needed to keep, and I think that's a good thing. It's going to be very character-driven. You're going to need to protect your characters, because if you lose your favorite character, you can't just throw it back out. It'll be dead. The goal is to gain power, which is the goal of anything in the Game of Thrones. So I think all that works. I love their intrigue, military, and power challenge phase structure. I think it adds a lot of strategy. So I'm glad they kept that instead of just doing something more basic. The things they're getting rid of, Moribund, Influence, and hopefully streamlining those endless number of flowcharts. Those really were the biggest things. And one thing they don't mention here, but that I've seen in the various previews, the houses seem more focused again. One of the problems we had as a group towards the end of it was all the houses could do everything. There were really no limits. You could make... I made a Stark deck that was just as good an intrigue as a Lannister deck. So there was almost no point to the house that you picked. Everything could do everything. And things seem a little more focused. I think there's going to be less of the shutdown deck problem that we had gotten to. You know, thousands of cards were available in the last edition. And my gaming group, we all had what we call a shutdown deck, where if you got certain things just right, game was over. You were essentially playing solitaire because of all the powerful things some of these cards can do. And I think they've learned from that. They've scaled back some of the things, and more importantly, focused the houses to be good at what they should be good at, and weak at what they should be weak at. And that's the most important thing for me that I've taken away from the previews, which I might do some videos on later for each of the houses. And then most of the stuff here, I'm very happy with. We'll see. I mean, attachment cards weren't useless as long as they don't nerf them, I'll be happy. If they can somehow make them better, even better. The gold curve, we'll see. It would be nice to see some more higher cost cards that are worth putting in your deck. The drop cap, I'm glad to see gone. Plot building decks, being able to include 2 of everything, very good. And the ability to include other factions just because you want to, I think is good. They seem to have a good limit on it, a good way to control it. That's great. The extra factions, I don't really care. House Tyrell, not my thing, but I know some people that might be interested in it. I'm very excited. If not play the Night's Watch, at least see them get played. I think they're going to be a very interesting faction. So I hope you found something useful in my 15-minute rant here on the Game of Thrones card game 2nd edition. And in the future, I might see about doing a few more on the specific houses.